Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. Today we're going to be sharing some creepy and allegedly true stories from the woods and the great outdoors. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share, be sure to submit them at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'm always looking for fresh new stories from the outdoors to share here on the channel. Some of these stories today may be new to you and some of them you may have heard before. Today is going to be an extra long compilation of all the scariest and fan favorite picked horror stories from the woods that I've shared in the past couple of months. Now, as always, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and get ready for some creepy and allegedly true horror stories from the woods. Hey swamp folk, just as a quick reminder, I am a part of the Chilling family, and if you haven't yet, be sure to take your advantage of the free trial. Chilling is definitely the new home of horror, and an amazing mobile app that allows you to do things that are not at all possible on YouTube. With hundreds of amazing stories that are sorted in a curated playlist or playlists you can create yourself, we give you so much flexibility to listen the way you want. This includes a Chilling exclusive feature, our ambient menu. Change the background noise of the story at will to fit your mood. It's an absolute game changer. And of course, this is offered completely and totally ad-free. That's right, no ads, just hours and hours of uninterrupted, horrifying, creepy, and all-around spooky content. So what are you waiting for? Join me, Being Scared, Your Maker, Mr. Creeps, Mr. Creepypasta, and many other horror narrators on Chilling. You can find the link to download and start your free trial today in the description down below. Come join Chilling, the new home of horror. I have lived most of my life in Montana. I grew up near the Crow Reservation and knew quite a bit about their history and lore. During the summer of 2020, I worked at a local state park that had been a part of the Crow's traditional land. It is a site that contains a lot of their history, from things like pictographs to actual burial sites. My manager would tell me about the area, and I loved hearing the stories that fueled the legends around it. But one day, I learned just how correct the codes are. It was a hot July day, and I had snuck out of the visitor center to take a break from people. I walked into a gully and climbed up onto a rock that let you see the center and remain out of sight. It was also the only place where I had cell service. I enjoyed sitting in the shade, listening to the birds, but another sound caught my attention. It was the sound of rustling bushes further up the gully. I tried not to panic, but my manager told me a mountain lion would sometimes wander around here. There was no exit in that direction due to the earthquake that blocked the path, only allowing a small stream through the large boulders. No matter what it was, it had to come my way. The rustling got closer until it was just above me. I peeked over the rock to see absolutely nothing. I sat still, watching the spot, but my fight or flight motion kicked in, and I ran down the narrow path back to the visitor center. I thought that was it for my worry, but things got weirder over the next couple of days. A few days later, I walked into the center to see my two coworkers staring at a display case that showed Native American tools. I asked what was wrong, and one of them pointed at the glass that covered the artifacts. Tiny handprints covered the case, traveling in every direction, as if something had climbed it. I didn't think much of this, but I didn't feel it was strange since our park barely got any visitors due to the pandemic at the time. We got a few travelers, but rarely did they come into the center. We cleaned off the case without another thought and got back to work. The next day I came in and once again my coworkers were gawking at the case. The tiny handprints were back. I started to get nervous, and we cleaned all the glass as quickly as possible. Later that day, as I was alone in the visitor center at the front desk reading a book, I started to hear something like a radio play in the back room. I listened for a bit, trying to make out what was playing, but it was too muffled to pick anything out. When I stood up to investigate, it went quiet. This happened a few times over the next few days. One day, the sounds were getting so annoying, and I decided to sit outside next to my manager. We talked for a bit, and somehow we talked about Crow lore. One that is popular in Crow culture is the Little People, a group of small humanoid creatures that like to cause mischief. If you see one, that means you are going to experience misfortune. They will do anything to get you to leave, such as throwing rocks or setting up traps. I made a joke about spending the night at the center and camping near the cave that has pictographs. My manager stopped me, quickly, and told me that would only put me in danger. He said many people had tried it, and no one stayed the whole night. Something always chased them away. So I gave up on staying at the park alone. After that, though, things just kept getting worse. I stopped going to my rock due to a weird noise coming from the gully. The radio noise was playing more often. Then something happened that led my manager calling a medicine man to the center. I was sitting inside. My manager was on the phone talking to a water testing facility since the water had suddenly become undrinkable. He angrily hung up on the phone and said he was going out to smoke. I watched him leave and then returned to my book. After a while, I started to hear talking from the back room. I listened and it kinda sounded like it was my manager talking. It sounded like he was talking about the water testing people. I couldn't make out exactly what he said, but he was angry. I kept listening as I stood and walked out to the front of the window to see if anything was interesting outside. A few cars were in the parking lot, but everyone avoided the visitor center like usual. I noticed someone walking up the sidewalk to the center. It was my manager. A sudden chill ran down my spine and I began to shiver. The talking in the other room was still happening. When my manager got inside, I explained quickly what was going on, and he could hear it too. But it stopped as we approached the door to the room. We rushed inside and of course there was nothing and no one there. The back door was even locked. My manager immediately got on the phone and hired a crow medicine man to come the next day. They performed a cleansing ceremony that took a few hours. After that, everything seemingly stopped. No more radio noises or handprints on the glass. I also, for some reason, felt a weight lifted off of me. Some people thought it was little people, while others said it was evil spirits that attached themselves to the site. I won't know the truth as I don't work there anymore, but whatever it was has led me to take a lot of caution when I'm near sacred sites such as this, and to be very wary when working out in the woods as well.
This happened last summer, and it still sends shivers up my spine when I think back to it. I was traveling for business. I had to take something to one of our laboratories, and it had to be there that night to be used in the morning. So I ran it along the express highway, passing Mount Fuji, and about to enter a toll road. I didn't want to do this as I didn't want to pay. Plus I thought I might be able to shave a few minutes off the estimated time of arrival if I took a detour. But boy was I wrong. So I turned down a road close to Aokigahara, which is where that famous forest is. You've heard of it, right? I had to slow down a little as there was a fog bank on my approach, and it was plain sailing for a while. That is until my lights abruptly died. I pulled onto the hard shoulder and hit my hazards, and was of course frustrated. I figured a fuse must have blown or something. So I popped the hood and started messing around, trying to desperately fix it. But when I realized I was probably causing more harm than good, I gave up and slammed the hood shut. I considered driving without the lights, but even if it hadn't have been a foggy night, it was an idiotic idea. So I slumped in the driver's seat at a loss, not knowing what to do next, when suddenly I was struck with tinnitus. You know, that terrible ringing in your ears. It was awful and made me feel sick, and I'd never had it that badly before. Just then I looked up and noticed something in my rearview mirror. It was a shadowy figure standing behind my car, and the moment I laid eyes on it, I heard something. It was the roar of some kind of animal. This was all going on at around 2:30 in the morning, so there's no good reason anyone would be out here on the mountain roads. What I saw in the mirror looked humanoid, and a thick, dense forest surrounded me for as far as the eye could see. There wasn't a single car on the road when I heard the sound of footsteps running around me outside. They were audible, even though my engine was still on, and I could feel something coming for me. I felt surrounded and trapped. Those awful footsteps grew louder and louder, and I just had to get out of there. I was thinking about opening the door and running for it, but could imagine not getting far and becoming a missing person. They'd find my car out here, and I'd become one of those cold case mysteries. But just then, as I was thinking about seeing my parents being interviewed on TV, I heard something strike the rear window. It wasn't a rock or anything like it, and it sounded sticky, like something fleshy had landed and stuck there. I did not want to see what it was, so I dragged my rearview mirror out of position and hit the gas. I was driving straight into the fog with no light, and just as I was about to enter a tunnel, the light suddenly came back on. Relief washed over me as I reached the next toll booth early, and I swear to God that was the only time in my life that I was happy to see one of those things. The lights of the toll booth were so comforting after what I had just experienced. I finally felt safe, and after a little while I pulled into a convenience store to get a coffee and check over my car. It was covered with morning dew, as I'd been driving through the fog, and the windows were wet. However, on seeing the rear of my vehicle, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was what seemed to be handprints of various sizes all over my back window. Since that incident, I have never tried to avoid toll roads to find shortcuts, and I have no explanation for the handprints or what made that horrible roaring sound. I don't like to think about the number of people who go missing around here.
To start this off, I'm a 36-year-old man from a small town outside of Charleston, West Virginia. And a little backstory about myself. Since I was young, I could see things most could not, from ghosts of deceased grandparents to other unexplained things, so I have been around ghosts and stuff my entire life, and none of these ever really scared me. At least, none until this 2021 hunting season. Deer hunting, to be exact. Before I start, I would also like to mention I am a huge fan of your YouTube channel. I listen to it sometimes all night at work, and it helps me get through my long nights. Anyways, on to the story. Since I was a young boy, I have been an avid hunter, and has always enjoyed the peace and quiet and tranquility of being in the mountains with nature. So a couple of years ago, a few friends and I secured a property lease of nearly 1,200 acres. I have been hunting this area for years, and I have never seen anything scary on the property, other than maybe a black bear or a coyote from time to time. After setting out multiple cameras for the 2021 hunting season, I decided to hunt a new location due to the deer frequenting another area more than I had hunted in the past. Before the season, I moved my hunting equipment into this new location and drove in a couple of more cameras to better understand where the deer would most likely be coming from once the hunting season started. After a month of watching hundreds of pictures, hunting season was finally here. I hunted this area for most of the hunting season with some success as I bagged a white-tail buck, as did my daughter later in the season. Now, fast forward from October to middle November. As I was still running my trail cameras in this location, getting ready for the West Virginia rifle season, I started noticing that my pictures all began to blur. So I would clean the camera lens, thinking something was blocking it. But it did not help that the pictures would only keep getting more distorted to the point that you could barely make anything out but black and gray. I figured this camera was just going bad, hence I purchased a new camera and placed it in the same spot, only to discover that this new camera was taking the same pictures in black and gray with nothing obstructing the camera's view. A couple of days went by, and although weird, I decided to pull the camera for the year as rifle season was starting in a couple of days anyway. Also, I would like to add that the pictures are great on both cameras once I moved the camera to a different location, which will make sense shortly. Now, it is finally rifle season, and I'm on the first morning. I'm up 2 to 3 hours before daylight for the day's hunt. Once I made it to my hunting stand and was quiet as possible, I settled up for what would be an all-day hunt. About 30 minutes before daylight, I begin to hear what I can only describe as whispering noises coming from about 50 yards away. As I sit and wait for the sun, the whispers come and go, and I think to myself, this must be other hunters that have slipped into our lease without permission, and that once it got daylight, I was going to have to make them leave. Once daylight comes, I start looking for the trespassers, and to my surprise, there is no one near me. Thinking that I must have just been hearing things, I brush it off and continue to hunt. At around 10 a.m., I listen to this sound once more. Looking around, I notice something moving to my right and across a small stream. I focus my eyes and quickly see it's a woman, dressed in what I can only describe as 1800s-style clothing. Please note it is freezing this morning, and this woman is at least a mile deep in the wilderness, dressed only in what appeared to be some old white dress or apron. I watched this woman for a few moments, and she then turned and seemed to walk inside a rather large and hollow oak tree. I thought to myself, what in the world did I just see? Trying to make any sense of this, I began to hear the whispering again, coming from where the lady or whatever this was had just gone. I don't make a move. I continue to stare at this tree after what seemed like forever. I notice movement once more from the tree. I keep watching as I see this woman-looking thing re-emerge, followed by what looked to be a small child, maybe 8 to 10 years old. Shocked once more, I watch the pair as they walk around the tree in a single file. Once at the backside of the tree, the kid bends down and looks to pick something off the ground. Then, suddenly, the pair both in non-human speed dash back around and inside the tree. At this point, I began to think to myself how weird this was and so out of place, but I never heard the leaves crunch or any noises that they were even outside of the tree. Weird, I thought. After sitting for a couple of minutes more, I decided to confront the two and see if there was anything I could do to help them or figure out what they were doing here in the first place. With rifle in hand, I began to climb. I slowly make my way down the tree where the pair had been. As I cross the stream separating us, I look up at the tree, and to my surprise, the tree was no longer there. It is like it had just disappeared in the blink of an eye. I spent almost an hour looking and walking around, trying to find out where this tree could have been, but I never found any trace. Puzzled over this, I began thinking about the cameras I had remembered, the ones going blurry and having really bad points even though they worked just fine in other locations. I decided that I need to know what happened to me, so I set up a few cameras in that area. 2 days later, I had my cousins come with me to retrieve all of the equipment from this area, and I will never be pursuing in this area again. Please let me know in the comments if anyone knows what I may have witnessed, and if you choose to share this story, thank you. It would mean a lot to me. I really would appreciate somebody giving me any sort of idea in the comments what this could be. I go hunting in southern Illinois on property that my family owns. The place is my second home, and I spent countless hours exploring every inch of it. Caught all the fish in its area, hunted every legal game, and spotted the rest. So when I say that I have never had an experience like this, remember that this was my domain, that I felt comfortable in any weather, at any time, with any equipment or lack thereof. 2 deer seasons ago, I had pulled into the farm at around 4:40 in the morning, November, so at least 2 hours till sunlight. I pull my stuff out of my truck and walk into the woods. I have my shotgun and revolver and knife on my belt, an elbow light clipped to the front of me, a coffee thermos, a backpack with a book, and a couple of other things to clean my deer should I get lucky. So I walk off the driveway and into the woods. The tree stand I'm going to is less than a mile away, but through some dense second-growth forest and down a rather steep hill, across some bottoms, then a long, burning steep climb up another ridge. I always dread the hike, but it's a good spot so I often do it. I make it down to the bottoms, slush through the icy muck, and get to the climbing. With my flashlight clipped to my chest, I keep needing to physically turn my body to throw the beam around to see trees and recognize my determined path. This, of course, always gives the forest a horror movie vibe, even on the best of days. The leaves and underbrush are encased in frost, so every one of my steps comes with a signature, solid crunch no matter how quiet I'm trying to be. This time, though, I noticed there was more noise than usual. Something else was crunching close by. I walked about a quarter of the way up the hill listening to my company the whole time, seeming to stay the same distance away as I moved. Naturally, I think I may have a quick hunting day, so I plop my ass down onto a tree. I can't shoot till first light, but I'm hoping that whatever I'm hearing will lounge around until then. So I click my light off, unsling the shotgun, and lay it over my knees to wait. Except, I don't hear anything now. Whatever it was must have been spooked by the flashlight spinning all around as I sat. I still stayed a bit, sipping some coffee to make sure, but I gave up after 15 minutes of dead silence from the forest floor. I probably didn't make 4 steps before the second moving thing started again. At this point, I'm still not freaked out yet. I stay facing the way I am, flip the light off again, and sidestep behind a tree. Sure enough, I don't hear anything. 2 minutes of sitting there, frustrated before I start moving again, and my new friend does too. I began to get freaked out because I worked my way up the hill, stopping to turn and look, and when I stopped, the sound would go on for just an incalculably more extended amount of time than my steps, like something seeing me stop and doing its best to stop before I heard it. This happened no less than 4 times, and by now I'm sweating bullets and cold because I'm sweating bullets in the middle of winter. I abandoned my thermos near a tree to hold my flashlight and my revolver at the same time. The last 300 or so feet to my stand was done backwards so that I could be facing the noise, and in theory, keep it from moving. I didn't hear nothing again after that. I got up into my stand and smoked like 5 cigarettes in a row out of anxiety. It gave me a sense of security being up in a tree behind camouflage. Still, I only hunted for a couple of hours before daylight finally hit, and then I went back early. I wasn't moving slow when I went back to the truck though. I was running full sprint. I have not told my family about it because they wouldn't believe me, but damn, it was freaky. The sound and when it decided to stop felt very human, which it likely was as poachers and trespassers occasionally wander onto our property. Still, ever since then, when I go hunting, I'm much better about letting people know where I'm going and for how long. This took place during my winter break during my first year of college. This was well over a decade ago now. My friend and I decided to head to a rifle range we had frequented previously during high school. It'd been about 10 months since we were last there. It's in the northeast United States. The rifle range was outdoors, unmanned, and on the state game lands. You never know who may be there. I'd encountered some strange, possibly sinister people there in the past. A fair amount of ordinary people too, of course. We parked the truck and I immediately noticed skinned rabbits, dozens of them everywhere. At first, they would be obscured by the grass that had grown so tall, but now, being dead of winter, it was easy to see. Falling over, cartling these neatly arranged rows of small skinned animals. Possibly rabbits, raccoons, possibly other things. It disturbed me how hard it was to tell what something is once the skin was removed. It bothered me that someone would lay the new carcasses next to the old ones. Each neat pile was in a different state of decay. Despite our better judgment, my friend and I decided to enter the rifle range. I grabbed my 2 rifle cases. They're like plastic guitar cases. This will come into play later. The rifle range is a large bunker cut into a taller hill. It extends about 1,000 feet, and the walls on the left are about 40 to 80 feet tall. There's a question-marked shaped path leading around the bunker to the gallery, where you stand or sit to shoot. Unsure of the proper terminology, to be honest. Approaching the trail, I noticed a dead deer off the left of the course. Then another one off to the right. Then another one further down, in the center of the system, decomposing. A large hole in its abdomen, filled with maggots. There's another that's all maggots aside from the bones. I'd never seen anything ever like it. My friend and I carry on, me in the front. Once we round the corner into the gallery area, there are 2 to 3 more dead deer, like a deflated deer balloon on the gravel. almost nothing left of them, two-dimensional. This is when it sets in how shabby the place has become. Everything is overgrown. Even looking downrange, the grass had nearly covered the whole area up to 2 to 3 feet, except for a trail in the center leading towards the back of the bunker. Along this path, there is one dead deer every 50 feet or so on the side of the trail. The number of deer carcasses I've seen now is outrageous. There had to be 20 of them. It felt beyond belief. About 500 feet downrange, there's a pack of dogs, maybe 8 to 10, an almost ridiculous-looking number, all circled the deer and eating it. I'm standing right at the front of this path. I turn back and my friend is pale-faced at this point. This sight that we're both looking at is horrifying. I, like a complete idiot, say something along the lines of, "What the hell?" Immediately, one of the dog's ears perk up. It picks its head up and looks right at me. Like this was slow motion, it lets out a quick bark and the whole circle of them in a carousel lift their head one by one and lock their eyes on me. I glance back at my friend and he already started running. He probably was about 20 feet in front of me. I look back downrange and see the dogs are already charging toward me. They already look twice as close. I start running as hard as possible with these 2 gun cases, loaded to the brim, super heavy. I can't full-on sprint holding these things. I'm debating dropping them to run faster. I go around the corner and around the bunker entrance. I looked back and saw they're already in the gallery, skidding on the gravel to square the corner. 8 to 10 of the most mangy-looking hellhounds coming for me. I'm hoofing it as hard as I can. It's now a roughly straight shot to my friend's pickup truck. I glance back and now they're only a couple of feet behind me. I'm not going to outrun them and it's very clear. I think about dropping the cases. I glance again over my right shoulder and see something forever burned into my memory. A dog midair, leaping at me, fangs out, hopelessly close to me now. I'm in full-on sprint, looking forward again, waiting to feel this thing's jaws sinking into my calf or thigh. Total temporal distortion. Time slowed down. I thought of how I just saw a show on the History Channel. An old man, a World War II vet, had survived a mountain lion attack. He said that if a rabid dog attacks you, raise your forearm in front of your throat. They'll latch onto it and won't let go. I'm waiting for this to happen, getting knocked down. I envision when one gets into my leg, rolling onto my back, throwing my arm up to catch whatever's going for my throat, then being torn to pieces by the other 7. I realized this could be how it ends, astonished, being mauled to death. It felt like someone pushed me forward, giving me a burst of speed, then another, almost causing me to fall forward. Then I realized the dogs were smacking off the big guitar cases hanging off my sides, which, each time, would push me forward. This happened 5 or 6 times. Just then, I was crossing in front of the truck. I threw the gun cases on the hood, open the door, and hop in. My friend is already in the driver's seat. The dogs are gone, and I'm feeling like I just escaped death from a horror movie. Expecting to hear some words of relief for my fate, my friend instead calls me an idiot for leaving the guns on the hood. I guess he wants to shoot at them. I tell him that he needs to just get over it, and we need to get the heck out of here. I almost died right in front of him. Eventually he gets out, gets the rifles from the hood, puts them in the back of the truck, and we get out of there. On the way home, I see a local cop at the gas station. It's inside his municipality. I'm telling him about the range and what had happened as briefly as possible, how it's a danger, etc. He seemed to get more aggravated the longer I talked, so I stop. There's an awkward silence and he coldly says, "Yeah, it's really bad out there." From his tone and body language, I can tell his exchange is over. He goes back to his conversation with the cashier, and I just turn around and leave without saying any more. I still wonder what the hell I walked into. What if I had dropped those gun cases? Why was someone dumping their illegally skinned carcasses at a rifle range on state game land? What killed all those deer? The place was fairly well maintained for most of those years that I used to go, and we had been there inside the last year. So what happened? What were those dogs? Were they coyotes, wolves? Why were the cops so dismissive? The range is gone now. It's a natural gas oil well there now. I don't really know where to post this. I've been looking for shows to send this into, and I figured the Swamp Dweller was probably the best person to send it to. When I was, best guess, 8 years old, I visited my cousins at their house across the neighborhood. Being a group of bored children, we decided to bring my cousin's neighbor Jaden on a hike through a massive area of woods behind our house. We set off, stepping over poison ivy and making our way over to an abandoned paintball place in the middle of the woods. We explored the nooks and crannies of the site, eventually wandering into the hills and streams of the Michigan wilderness. We were having fun and having hiked almost a full mile from where we began. An odd thing to note before I continue is that the ground was covered entirely in garbage. You could barely take a step without stepping in old plastic bags or discarded tins of instant potatoes, or something of that nature. We joked that maybe there was a neighborhood back there at one point, but now it seems evident that this was nothing but an old drug hangout or a place where hobos lived, and we never thought much of it. Being a humid summer night, the air hung thick with the smell of water, leaves, and mud. We ventured on, finding places where the ivy grew a pale color, seeming to reflect the gray sky. The hills were brutal and tricky to climb. At some point, we got turned around and found ourselves lost at the entrance of some old, out-of-use ATV trail or something like that. We warily stepped onto the trail, hoping to find a neighbor's house or the street we lived on. But we had no luck. We were lost miles from home. I was put off by how the trees grew together to form an intimidating archway over our path. The four of us locked eyes as we all heard a familiar sound. Breathing. It came from a bend in the way and was obscured by the now twilight sky. Suddenly, we heard hulking footsteps crunching on the pre-autumn leaves. They came straight for us. People say they freeze in fear, but that was not my experience. That theory went 0 to 4 of our group. We immediately booked it out of the trail, onto the main path we hiked on, and sprinted. Primarily blinded through the woods, until we saw the light on the top of an ominous hill, the hill behind our house. We scrambled up the mountain, dirtying ourselves and getting cut up on the hill's bushes and brambles. We booked it inside and were too tired to explain to our parents, so we huddled in the TV room and basked in the air-conditioned glory of safety. This happened to me when my pals and I went on a dropping trip. A dropping is when you are dropped at a place that you don't know and you have to find your way home while people in cars hunt for you, and when they spot you, you get a point. The person with the least points who gets to the designated place is the winner. My brother and 6 of my pals were fooling around acting stupid as we always did, causing my dad to say, "Don't you numbskulls have anything better to do?" Like what, Dad? And my dad started thinking, "Well, how about something outside?" To which I just chuckled, but before I could say anything, Terry just said, "What do you guys think about a dropping trip?" We all agreed to this and made our home the place where we had to end up after being dropped. My parents dropped us all off. My mom said, "Okay, let's see how long it takes you guys to travel 20 miles. They drove off, and we all went in different directions. Now at this point I understand 20 miles is a bit excessive. I've always been terrible with directions, so going through the woods probably wasn't the best idea either. I walked around for what seemed like hours until I heard a crying dog. Me being an animal lover, I went to look for what was wrong. I saw a wolf stuck in a bear trap, and I slowly walked toward the trapped wolf. It growled at me, but I slowly started getting closer to help it, with the wolf starting to calm down and allowing me to set it free. The wolf looked at me and then just jumped up and walked off, to which I did the same. After what felt like an hour, I accepted that I was lost, and I just told myself that if I just keep walking in a straight line, I would eventually find my way to a road or something like that. I walked and walked for what felt like hours, but was still stuck in the woods when I heard branches breaking from behind me. My heart was pounding very hard, and I was getting more scared by the minute as the sun was starting to go down. In my mind, I was expecting a huge bear or something like that, but I heard a weird type of growl, more like a gurgling. I started running, which I know is not the smartest thing to do when facing a wild animal, but fear got the better of me in that moment. Not looking where I was running, I tripped and fell, hearing the footsteps gaining fast. It was then I heard barking, and I went to look behind me and saw the wolf I had saved that was barking and standing in front of me. I then looked at the creature that was running after me. It was something that was extremely skinny with claws and was running away now. It ran in a weird way that I can't even describe. It was almost as it wasn't used to running and has never done it before. And then, this thing continued to do that gurgling growl. It was clearly coming from that creature. After the creature was out of sight, the wolf stopped barking, and when I stood up, it was standing right next to me. As I walked again, the wolf didn't leave my side and growled a few times more as I kept walking. Finally, I found a road with a diner, and after a few minutes, I realized it was the diner my dad usually goes to with his friends. So I was relieved to see a familiar sight. I turned my gaze to the wolf, and it was gone. I already began to hear that gurgling growl again, though. I'm pretty sure that wolf protected me and saved my life because I helped it. I've heard many stories of wolves doing this with people, and I'm just absolutely blown away that I was able to experience this. When I was at the door of the diner, I looked back to where the wolf and the creature were supposed to be fighting or whatever, but I didn't see anything. I arrived home last and clearly lost the dropping, but my mom looked at me and said, "What happened to you?" And I told them everything. My cuts from the fall, the wolf, everything. Occasionally, I still talk about this story. I don't think many people believe it, but it's something that I'll forever cherish. But it really freaked the hell out of me. Does anybody have any idea what that creature could have been? From research, it kind of sounds like a skinwalker or a wendigo or something along those lines, but I know that's incredibly cliche. I moved from Idaho to Alaska about 2 months ago, and already I have experienced something I never thought I would ever experience. After taking a week to recover from a 5-day trek across Canada on the Alaska Highway, I decided I was going to get out and explore the wilderness of my new home state and try to catch a glimpse of the wildlife such as moose and bears. The house I'm renting is on the outskirts of the nearest town, so I basically live right in the middle of the forest and have access to miles of dense woods. I still don't know what I'd been thinking when I decided to go into the woods without anything but my phone, which at the time didn't get much service in Alaska, and some earbuds. I began running at a medium pace into the woods, hopping over bushes and branches while jamming out to some shaky graves. I had probably gone through about 5 songs when my shoelace got hooked on a fallen tree and I was thrown to the ground face first. I immediately got back up, swore out of irritation, and began to put my earbuds back in when I realized I had no idea where I was. At some point I had lost my sense of direction and had only but a faint idea as to which direction I had came from. I started to run the way I thought I had came from when I began to panic and second guess myself, when I realized I should have come out into my backyard ages ago. I didn't want to panic because I knew that it would make everything worse. Panicking never helps. I started to try and pinpoint the right direction. Of course, I eventually realized that I was hopelessly and utterly lost without the slightest indication of which way would bring me to some sort of civilization. After a few brief moments of cursing and groaning, I decided I would follow my gut and go in the direction I thought would possibly lead me home. I started running at full speed, hoping to break the tree line in a matter of minutes, when something on the ground caught my eye. It was a backpack. I stopped instantly and looked around for a person or a campsite, but there was nothing I could see from the spot I was at, which was situated at the bottom of a small hill. The bag looked as if it had been abandoned for quite a few days at least, but was slightly damp from the rain earlier that morning. I kneeled and picked the bag up, resting it against my knees. It had a heavy weight to it when I moved it, so I knew there was something inside. Looking back now, I remember the dark feeling I got in my chest right before I unzipped the main part of the backpack. Inside, there were bags of what I immediately knew were some sort of assortment of illegal drugs and items used to administer them. I quickly stood up and took a step back. I had such a powerful feeling of dread that I felt like I was in imminent danger. I just wanted to get out of there and find my way home, so I started running again to the top of the hill. I was hit with a wave of excitement when I saw a house at the bottom that was buried in the trees. I had begun to start to make my way for it when something told me to stop inside my head. It crept into my mind that what I had just discovered was awfully close to this house. I wanted so badly to be out of the woods and find some form of civilization, but something told me that I just wasn't safe out here. I ran away from the house along the tree line, hoping that I would possibly stumble upon another house. After about 10 to 15 minutes, I stumbled into a neighborhood of sorts and asked a man working in his yard for directions. He was kind enough to drive me home and assure me everybody gets lost in Alaska at some point. As soon as I got home, I showered and chugged some water, then immediately called the police to report what I had seen. However, since I had no idea where I was, I couldn't tell them where to find the drugs or where the house was, so my report was basically useless. I just felt so guilty if I hadn't at least said something. I've driven all over the area down different roads trying to find that house, but I never have. It's probably for the best though, because I don't want to get caught up in something I shouldn't be in. I'm glad I listened to my gut that day and kept running from that house, because people in possession of such many illegal drugs can be extremely dangerous. And I'm just glad I didn't die out there when I got lost. A quick disclaimer before this story: there are some touchy subjects and very slight mentions of possible SA. If this is a trigger for you, please skip the stories using the timestamps. Thank you very much. This happened in South Carolina. I recently was watching one of your episodes and something similar happened to another woman in the area, so I seemed it would be a good time to tell this story. This was one of the worst experiences of my life, and I hadn't thought about it for a very long time. Many friends tell me I should write a book of all the horrible things that have happened in my life because it would be more than a person can handle. I was dating a guy for a couple of weeks and went to one of his friends' homes in the middle of nowhere. It was a run-down, older mobile home, but who am I to judge? We went there, and there were 4 other guys. I thought it was odd that I was the only girl, but just shrugged it off. They wanted to play a drinking game, and back then I was a little wild, so I was game. After about an hour, things got a little weird. I could see them looking at each other, like there was an inside joke. I decided to get up and go to the bathroom. When I came back out, someone pushed me into the bedroom and locked the door. It was completely dark. I banged on the door telling them this is not funny. The door opened and they all came in and shut the door behind them. I could feel them grabbing at me and laughing. I was fighting to get away and hitting, but they were too strong. The door opened and they all left. I could hear them outside in the hall and it didn't sound good. They were discussing what they were going to do to me. I didn't understand what was going on at all at the time, but I quickly figured out whatever they were planning was not going to be good. The door opens and my mind is going a mile a minute, and how I'm going to survive this. The guy comes in and sits on the bed and said he was going to get me out of there. He said they went too far and he didn't know they were going to hurt me. He said he thought it was a joke. There was a back door across from the bedroom, and he said for me to run through the woods as fast as I could and get to the road and he would come and find me. I did just that. I ran as fast as I could and I could hear them yelling for me to come back. I could hear them coming. I got to the road and hid behind a tree. After getting lost for quite some time, I felt like I was running in circles for what seemed like an hour until I eventually found the road again. I saw a car pull up and it was him, and he was pretty bloody. They had beat the crap out of him for letting me go. He had my purse and ended up taking me home. I didn't know if I should trust him, but I had no other choice. I was in the middle of the woods, lost and completely scared. I heard a couple of months later he was arrested for killing his girlfriend, and the guy who took me there was arrested for assault on another woman. Maybe if I had gone to the police that night, this wouldn't have happened, but I can't blame myself for that. My cousin still loves me telling her this story at 21 with a 2-year-old kid. She always told me to share this with more people, so I guess this is the best way to have more people actually hear this story. It might be a fun campfire story to tell others yourself. Anyway, here it is. There is a legend about these woods that are called the Burberry Witch, a witch that can control some terrifying creatures but will only do so when provoked or angered and will grant you something you want but for a price. My stepfather was a terrible man, hitting my mother, scolding her, and even threatening to seriously hurt myself. It was one of those days when my stepdad began to threaten to beat me, so I went to my room, locked it, and threw my head into the pillow of the bed, avoiding hearing any of the screaming. The day after, my mom knocked on my door and said that he had apologized like he had done all those times before, but my mom, she looked different. Almost a dead sort of look in her eyes. She then said that we would go to the cabin at the lake that used to belong to my grandparents, which they left to us after they died, and I just started packing. I wasn't very excited about it at all. We arrived at the cabin and I unpacked in my room. Of course, my stepfather wanted something and we were too slow to get it to him, so the scolding began. He would sit in a chair and just gulp the beer down like lemonade. He ordered my mom to get him stuff the whole time and was degrading her. I was so angry again, but I knew that I wasn't strong enough to take down anybody. Then it was time for dinner and we sat down at the kitchen table. It was still fairly sunny at that time, and it was then that he threw a plate of food at my mom and tried to pull my hair, but I got away. It was then that I could no longer take it. I headbutted him, which made him fall, and he yelled something obscene at me. I then burst out of the door running into the woods, not looking back for a second, crying and just going God knows where. After a while, I fell onto my knees just crying until I heard a noise. I looked up and there was a mountain lion. Out of fear, I fell backward on my hands with the mountain lion hissing at me, and I knew I would die right then and there. Then, out of nowhere, the mountain lion was grabbed by a massive claw with razor-sharp nails, followed by what sounded like a bear shouting and terrified. I closed my eyes. The mountain lion was making a huge ruckus that suddenly stopped, and immediately I felt fluids flow over me. It felt like a bucket of water being emptied over yourself. After 2 thuds, I slowly opened my eyes, and there it stood. A creature that looked like a black bear but bigger, with glowing blue eyes, and I noticed the claws that grabbed the mountain lion belonged to it. It growled, and I was so scared it would attack me when I heard clapping. The creature then just went on all fours and ran back into the woods. I checked myself and saw I was covered in blood. It had to be the blood of the mountain lion, but before I could get up, I heard a voice saying, "Oh my sweetie, are you all right?" A woman was now standing over me, extending her hand and smiling. I accepted her hand and she pulled me up to say afterward, "Sweetie, you seem to be covered in blood from that nasty mountain lion." The woman checked me and I checked her. Her hair was black with white parts in it and her eyes were a gorgeous baby blue. "Well, why don't we go to my house so you can freshen up, okay, sweetie?" she said with a huge smile, and since I felt no ill intent coming from the woman, I went with her. We arrived at a huge wooden house, and after the woman showed me where to freshen myself up, clearing the blood from my clothes and body, I sighed. "Oh, my goodness, what a huge sigh for such a young, sweet thing like you." And I sat in the chair that the woman had prepared for me, and told her everything. She stroked my cheek and said, "Well, after a few hours we shall go to your mom, and I'm sure that awful man will get what's coming to him. But for now, just close your eyes and sleep, sweetie." As she stroked my head, I fell asleep. The next morning I woke up and I was startled to see that I saw the head of a wolf. After I looked again, I noticed it was a carpet with a wolf head, and man, did I feel stupid. "Oh, so you are awake, sweetie. Now, here, have some breakfast," the woman said, and put a plate on the table near me. I got up and saw it was my favorite, pancakes. I ate as many as I could and I heard the woman giggle. "It tasted well, it seemed," she said with a huge smile, which she followed with, "Well, it's time to get you back now, sweetie." I really didn't want to go back to that man and got a little mad at the thought of seeing him, but the woman grabbed my hand and smiled. We started walking and I couldn't believe how far I had to run the night before as we walked. We heard a sort of chirping growl. I can't explain it any other way than that because it sounded like a bird if it would growl. The woman turned her head away from me and I could see she was looking angry at the direction the sound was coming from and waved her hand. The next thing I heard were some wings flapping, but couldn't see a bird or anything except the branches of the trees moving as we walked further. We arrived at the cabin and I knocked. My mom opened the door and just threw her arms around me. She hugged me tightly before we heard him saying, "The twerp's back and brought an old hag as well." The woman just said, "My sir, that is not a kind thing to say, but if I could please use your bathroom," and my mom looked at my stepdad. "Fine, just don't take too long." I walked the woman to the bathroom. She put a bag of coffee on the table nearby. My mind was trying to figure out when she had grabbed a bag since I was sure she didn't take one with her when we left. I walked a little with her to the bathroom, but I heard my stepdad yelling at my mom, "I'm going to go fish in a bit, and that hag better be gone." As soon as he stopped yelling, I noticed the woman was gone and I opened the bathroom where she was now not there. Now I started looking all over for her, and when I looked out the kitchen window, I saw her standing at the boat. How did she get there that fast without even going through any of the doors? The doors do creak after all. The woman clearly saw me and put her finger against her lip, winking at me. The kitchen door then slammed shut, and it was my stepdad who just put his hand on my mouth, gripping it tightly while saying, "Don't think I forgot about you, little troublemaker, because after I'm done fishing, you're mine." He let me go, and I heard the toilet flush and saw the woman coming out of the bathroom. In my mind, I was telling myself, how is this happening? She looked sternly at my stepdad, then walked out to the cool box, which was without a doubt filled with alcohol, and walked to the boat. He got on the boat when my mom walked into the kitchen and hugged me again. "I'm so happy you're okay, darling," she said with a sob in her voice, and the woman then put her hand on my mom's shoulder and said, "Don't worry, dear, that awful man will be receiving payback for everything he has done to the both of you very, very soon." And the woman quickly followed it up by asking if we wanted some tea, and of course we said yes. My mom and I just saw my stepdad struggling to reel something in. I then saw a huge spiked fin breaking the water. Then quickly, it went down in the water again. "Oh, sweetie, did you see something in the water?" the woman just blurted out of nowhere, sipping on tea. How could she possibly be sipping tea already? There was no way that the water would be warm enough for tea. But the woman just asked, "Are you going to have your tea, dears?" There were cups of warm tea standing in front of us. Then we heard the water stirring and saw the fin again. Then out of nowhere, a creature came out of the water, jumping on the boat. It was covered in scales that were green and blue, and its head looked like a piranha with webbed fingers and pointy nails. Suddenly, it slashed at my stepdad and hit his arm. My stepdad fell, and the creature went right after my stepdad. "Oh, what day is it today, dear?" was all the woman said as the creature was attacking my stepdad, to which my mom could barely make out, "It's Wednesday." The woman signed, which she followed, No, what a terrible thing of me to do. How could I forget to feed it yesterday?" After which she took a sip of her tea. Then we saw an arm flying out of the boat and blood was still flying everywhere. The lower half of the foot followed after as we watched in horror to what was happening in the boat. The creature went down even more, and when it was rising, it had the head of my stepdad in its mouth, lifting the body of my stepdad as well. We could see his blood-soaked clothing and the blood dripping from his neck. Then the creature slammed its jaws together, making the body of my stepdad drop, the blood dripping from the creature's mouth. With the body of my stepdad lying half out of the boat and half in the creature's mouth, it jumped back into the water. I and my mom, shocked by what we had witnessed. The woman just said, "Well, sweetie, I told you that awful man was going to get what was coming to him," and she put her cup down. "Oh my, you haven't touched your tea yet," she calmly said as she was walking out of the kitchen door and stopped. She turned her head around to us and said with a smile, "This one shall require no pay, as I despise such men, and you are always welcome to my woods, but please do not bring another like him, or there will be a payment." She walked to the edge of the wooded area and where the bear creature stood, and she stroked its chin while presenting a devilish smile on her face. This story goes way back to 1998 when I was 16 years old. I was with my two other friends, who I will call Ben and Jake for privacy reasons. So, it was a late summer evening on a Saturday, and I was sitting in my room listening to some 80s rock as teenagers back then would do. I got bored after some time and went outside to meet Ben and Jake. We were chilling in Ben's garage for a while, drinking beer and smoking some pot. We got bored quickly and went out to do some teenage stuff. I remember we were walking down this narrow path by the woods and down towards a lake. Back in the late 90s, there was a popular hangout spot for teenagers there, so we hoped to see some other people there. When we arrived, there was no one there except for the sound of crickets and tall grass. We sat there for a while on the bench and just talked for about 15 minutes when Jake wanted to go to an old fishing hut by the lake. We all agreed to go inside and explore it. We entered the place. While Jake and Ben were walking around and breaking stuff, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We went upstairs with an old wooden boat with a fishing net. We were checking it out when suddenly we heard the wooden door of the hut creak open. We could hear heavy footsteps entering down below. Heavy breathing followed shortly after. We all stopped dead in our tracks and almost held our breath. There was around a 5-second break that felt like an eternity when suddenly a man spoke in a drunken voice.
"I know you're here. Come out wherever you are, you little brats."
The heavy footsteps started to walk toward the stairs as the old floor creaked underneath. Jake went inside the wooden boat and the rest of us followed. We put the fishing net over our heads and didn't move. The man arrived upstairs and we could hear him stumbling around.
I can listen to you.
We were sitting dead still, but I could feel the fear in us. The man was walking around moving stuff. I thought of a plan to escape without being caught, but we were sitting ducks. Suddenly, we could feel the fishing net being ripped off.
Here you are.
Jake reacted the fastest and pushed him away, so the man fell onto his back and we ran like hell out of there and through the tall grass into the woods. We could hear the man give chase but gave up, probably due to his drunken state. We all went back to Ben's garage and fell onto the couch in exhaustion. Jake then told us that the man dropped a knife when he fell to the floor. We all were just sitting there in shock for the rest of the night. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Jake didn't push the man. Not too long ago, my brother and my mom told me about something my dad told them quite a few years ago, which always puzzled them. My dad passed away 10 years ago, so I can't really ask him about it, and it bugs me that I can't get more information. My dad loved being in the woods. They were like a second home to him. Whenever we would take a family trip to the woods, I would ask what animal sounds we heard, and they would always be able to tell me precisely what animal was making it, and any other details I asked about. He grew up on a farm, spent time working in the fire towers as a forest ranger, and enjoyed hunting, so he knew nature well. He was very familiar with the woods that we would take our family trips to, as some of the fire towers he worked were in that area still. I think only one building remains now though. My brother said that there was a weekend that my dad decided to take a trip to the woods by himself to do some small game hunting. Not unusual at all for him, actually. The strange part was that my dad came home very early. From where we lived at the time, it took 2.5 hours, and sometimes even longer depending on the traffic, to get to the woods that he liked. He didn't spend the night, even though he had brought everything he needed to camp for a couple of days. Both my mom and brother remember him coming home early, only my dad never mentioned why to my mom and only let it slip to my brother once. My dad told my brother that he heard something make a sound in the woods, which he had never heard in all of his life. He knew it wasn't from any of the animals in those woods. The sound made him pick up and head home during the night. My brother tried to press him for more details, but he quickly changed the subject and never wanted to discuss it again. He never described what the sound was. He just said it wasn't from any of the animals that inhabited those woods. My dad never really spooked, especially by nature. Whatever he heard, we have no idea. But it sure got to him good. It eats at me that I can't ask him about it. I want more details. My brother still takes trips to those woods and they've never heard anything out of the ordinary while out there. But my dad was such a stoic man that I know if something scared him that bad, it must have been pretty terrifying. Thanks for sharing my story, Swamp Dweller. I know it might not be as terrifying as others, but it's definitely strange and I think it's definitely a good story to share, to let people know that there are things in the woods that we can't quite explain all the time. Hello, Swamp Dweller. I found your channel after a friend told me that I might want to listen to one of the submitted stories. After listening to the story, I quickly realized why my friend said that. In the report mentioned, a group of campers went deep into the Rocky Mountain National Park and encountered a Bigfoot-like creature and a man hunting them. The author of the story said they used a fake name for the hunter, Vince. Well, I believe I was the hunter that the author mentioned. Some of the facts were a little off, but there were enough that I don't have much doubt. My name isn't Vince, but the author did say he made it up to keep some privacy, and I respect that, so I will go by Vince on here. My friend suggested I tell more of my experiences to try to help people, and though I disagreed at first, they convinced me. So let me start from the beginning. The author stated that I told him my daughter was taken in the story mentioned before. That is true, so I guess I'll start my account there. My daughter, wife, and I went to the park for a vacation in the early summer. I was working at a paper mill and had a week off, so the plan was to get a room, hike some trails, and enjoy the nature and the deep woods and each other for quite a few days. The day my daughter was taken, we decided to take a lesser known path instead of a much more popular one. I will forever regret that choice, and I will never forgive myself for it. It was my idea to switch trails that day since I didn't want to be around many people. After a while, we stopped so my wife could get lunch ready and my daughter wanted to play hide and seek. I didn't see the harm in it and agreed to play, and for her to hide first but not to leave the trail but more than a few feet. She was only 4, so I figured staying with the course would be safe. I peeked through my fingers as I counted not to lose track of her. She ran up the trail maybe 20 yards and ducked into a bush next to a tree. I finished counting and made my way up to the path to the bush, faking that I didn't know where she was. Once next to the bush, I kept up the act and could hear her trying to hide a giggle from inside the bush. I walked about 10 feet further up the trail and suddenly turned, trying to surprise her. What I saw will forever be etched into my mind. A large, heavily built humanoid creature stood with my daughter in its arms, holding its hand over her mouth. It was probably 6.5 feet tall with at least 3 feet of width at the shoulders. Even through the thick red fur, I could see its muscles quivering. I don't think it expected me to turn around because the look on its face was almost surprised. My daughter had tears running down her face and was trying her hardest to get free, but this thing was just too much for her little body. Its face looked like a weird mix of an ape and a human, and then it curled its lips at me as if to intimidate me. It had ridiculously long canines. It probably took less than 5 seconds for me to snap out of it and yell at it and start running towards it. It turned and took off up the tree with my daughter faster than I could even make the 10 feet. It made its way about 20 feet up in the tree, then looked down at me, curled its lips again, and proceeded to leap from tree to tree, still hanging on to my daughter. I tried to keep up, but this thing was just too fast. Once I realized I couldn't keep up, I yelled for my wife and told her to help while trying to find our daughter. You know how that turned out. The park rangers went through everything during the search, but no matter how many times I told them what I saw, they would say something about me being hysterical and not remembering right. I stayed after the search ended and kept trying to find signs of my daughter or this thing that took her. I waited until I lost my job for not coming back and my wife began to resent me. She thought I was crazy and blamed me for failing our daughter. It ended with her leaving me and moving across the area to where my daughter was taken. I began to feel a rage that I did not know I could feel. It built into me for so long. I felt like whatever this thing was robbed me of my daughter and her life. I fantasized about finding it and making it suffer until it died. As my fantasies grew, I began spending more and more time in the mountains, deep in the woods. I landed a job as a trail guide to support myself and keep looking for signs. I started planning how to bring this thing down once I found it. I decided that distance would be critical since it moved so fast that it could be on me before I got a shot off otherwise. I also would need something that could fire quickly and hard. I settled on the gun that the original author saw me with, a Springfield M1A SOCOM Scout rifle, chambered in .308 Winchester. It was lightweight, a semi-auto, hard-hitting, and able to reach out over 500 yards. It was a perfect fit. I took tracking courses along with bushcraft, and over time I learned the area of the mountains and woods better than most of its oldest locals. All of this took a few years, and I never found anything the whole time, until I did. I had made my way far into the mountains, and it was early summer, around the anniversary of my daughter's disappearance. I had been in the mountains for close to a week living off rations I took and some foraging. I noticed that the wildlife was sparse, but just thought it was because I was there. I had just purchased my first thermal scope and was sitting on a ridge looking down into the valley and was scanning. I was trying to see anything. I didn't really know what I was looking for at the time. I was just trying to see what I could pick up with it, I guess. I wasn't expecting to see much, but I was catching flashes of orange through the blue of the trees in the scope. Whatever it was moving at a decent pace, nothing a normal animal couldn't do, until I caught a clearer image of what it was, and I could tell that it was humanoid. My heart skipped a beat and I could feel my stomach in my throat. I remember thinking, no way, I finally found you. I watched it pass behind some trees and then climb up one into a clearing. I calculated that it was probably about 500 to 600 yards out, and I had a pretty clear line of sight. I wouldn't let this thing get away, so I switched the safety off my gun, extended my bipod, and laid prone to give myself every advantage. I had the wind to my face, so I knew it wouldn't smell me. And if I stayed still, I had it. I controlled my breathing and placed the crosshairs on this thing's head. I knew this was a gamble, but I needed to know if I killed it, I would have to do it in one shot. I pulled the trigger slowly and was almost surprised when the loud bang of the 308 rang out. I saw the orange spray from the creature's head, and it started to fall from the tree but reached out and clung to a branch. I put the crosshairs back on it at the center mass and put another round into it. It fell out of the tree and slammed into one of the units on the ground. I watched it lay there for a few seconds before the rage I had built up and bubbled up. I sent every round I had into this thing. Once I finished, I just watched its body lay there. I sat and felt a sense of relief come over me. I had avenged my daughter. I would bring this thing back to town and prove I wasn't crazy. I was thinking of trying to reach out to my wife after all these years when I heard a scream from the direction of the body. It was the most blood-curdling thing I'd ever heard, and my first thought that this thing was still alive. I jumped back on my scope, and what I saw sent chills through me. 2 more of these creatures were standing over the body, and were pushing as if trying to wake it up. I was frozen with fear. At that point, I had never considered there might be more than one. I watched one hurtle up the tree and began looking around like it was trying to find whatever had killed its partner. It looked directly in my direction and began shaking back and forth, almost breaking the tree and screaming. I slammed another magazine into the gun and took another shot at it. I saw the orange of its blood and the thermal scope spray out from behind it, and it jumped down to the ground from what had to be almost 50 feet up in the tree. The one in the ground was helping it up when I took a shot at it, and from what I could tell, I missed. It quickly dragged the wounded one with one arm and the dead one with the other into the forest where I couldn't see them anymore. I'm not going to lie here, I panicked when I lost sight of them. I was beyond scared and started building my fire to the point that it was a hazard to the forest. But at the time I didn't care. The rest of the night was uneventful, and as the hike back to town was very uneventful as well. That was the first time I found them. And it wouldn't be the last. I'm not going to go into every encounter since they get less dramatic and more like hunting stories as I learned their behavior. I knew that they preferred the deeper, more undisturbed parts of the mountains, and that the one that took my daughter was the closest one to town that I have seen, which leads me to believe it was an outcast for some reason and driven out of their normal area. They are hyper-aggressive while hunting and very efficient as well as intelligent. I don't think they are normal Bigfoot that get reported from my research. They stand a little shorter, and the large, almost baboon-type canines aren't reported in most Bigfoot sightings. Not to mention the aggression is much more with these. I assume they are similar subspecies, but I'm not a biologist and it doesn't make much of a difference. It doesn't matter to me that they are probably an endangered species or anything like that. They took my daughter, so I'm going to keep taking them until there are no more. I know that's not healthy, but it's where I stand. If you decide to read this for your viewers, they may have questions relating to Sam White Owl and characters that claim to be cryptid hunters. And if they wonder if I have any relation, that would be a no. I don't even know if those stories are true or not, but I've never even been approached or talked to anyone except for a friend who has encouraged me to write this. Now, if there is a secret society of monster hunters out there, I could definitely use the help. When I ran into the author and his group, I was only a few years into hunting them successfully and have had quite a few more run-ins since then. But they are getting more common. They are getting smarter and better at avoiding me. Whatever those things are, they are hunting me back. But luckily, I have found an ally in my friend who is going with me now. They had a violent encounter while elk hunting a few years back and have the same drive I do now to hunt these things down. I know this is a lot and it's not the typical story you read, but it does feel good to get some of it out there. The last author said to check the trees if you go into the forest, and they were right about that. But that's not always enough. Stay out of new parts of the mountain you're unfamiliar with unless you're in a group and armed. These things are fast, intelligent, and lethal. They hunt in packs and are rarely alone. If you see one, another one is already near you. Imagine the raptors from Jurassic Park but able to climb trees. Thanks for giving me a place to speak about this, and please, if anyone hears this, listen to me when I say, stay on the mountain trails and take this seriously. It could mean your life. I live in New Hampshire in the south suburban area. When I was younger, and currently, I lived in a couple of places because of divorce. I'll start with my mom's house. There were these woods that were behind my mom's house that we owned. We owned a pine-dominated acre, but the whole woods were about 20 acres. You could always see civilization from it, either the suburban house rows or a street on the other side that had no houses. These woods always felt warm to me, and I loved being in them. It was basically a third parent to me, a second home if you will. However, on the other side of the street was another forest, full of 10 to 20-year-old oaks and birches. One day, it was maybe 9 or 10. I was playing in the nice woods, and I had explored the whole 20 acres of them. I decided to check out the other woods on the other side of the street. The road was flanked on both sides by forest, and there was a nursing home down the street. I crossed the street, and the moment I entered the forest, my mind was telling me to get out of there. I had a sensation of being watched. However, I have always been curious, so I pushed deeper until it came to a circular, thinner part of the forest. Not a clearing, where there was a pile of trash ahead of me. Not drug paraphernalia, but old food and trashed clothing. Now my inner voice was screaming, get out, get the hell out of there. So I ran back through the woods as fast as I could until I reached the road and got back to the nice woods, and then I felt fine again. About 4 or 5 years later, I was kinda bored with the woods behind my house and wanted to check out the other forest again. I go back now with a knife and a holster to explore. I had my hand on my knife the entire time. I had this being watched and get out feeling again. I never found the thinned part, but I found shoes, dozens of old rotting shoes. There was also a camping stove with old propane cans, food trash, and camping pots. I picked it up and took some home since I needed cooking pots for camping. I still have them. The part that scared me though was the shoes. All kinds of them. Nice shoes, little shoes, women's shoes, running shoes, baby shoes, all varying ages and size and in different states of decay. I was freaked the hell out, but I kept pushing. I got to this 35-degree embankment, which I climbed and found a residential area above it. There was a thick fence with no gate, and the other houses had no gate either. The trash and shoes were too deep in the forest to be thrown in by some uncaring homeowners. I finally decided to leave. I was super scared by the time I got out of the forest, and I was and still am a very emotionally stoic person. However, the worst experience I have had yet was at my dad's house. Well, this was more of his neighborhood. It's a very tightly packed neighborhood that was surrounded by forest. Small forest of huge pines separated each house. It was not necessarily in a city, but it wasn't necessarily outside of one either, I guess, if that makes any sense. But every now and then I would see a moose, a deer, or anything like that. It's pretty rare to see them, but they do happen by sometimes. So one day I was walking my dog during dusk. It was almost total dark out and the streetlights were on. I got close to a turn in my walking path with this pine and oak forest, and I thought I spotted something in the forest in frozen terror. My gut wrenched in the most horrible, despicable feeling ever. It was like I just got the worst news of my life. It looked like a deer standing up. I don't think this was any sort of Wendigo or skinwalker, but it was just staring right at me on its hind legs. I originally saw its belly, but when I looked up to its face, it's almost like I couldn't make out any details about it. It was almost blurry, if that makes sense. I have good eyesight, and I should have been able to see it just fine, but it was like my central vision had suddenly been switched to a peripheral. It just blended in with the forest. I could see the body but not the head. Then it fell to the ground, got on all fours, and ran away in the most awkward... I don't even know how to explain it. It was like it didn't know how to walk. The forest was only about 50 feet away from me at that point. This thing probably could have ran and got to me in less than 5 seconds. I don't know what it was. I must have ran faster than I ever have in my life. What scared me the most is this thing probably had to clear a 6-foot chain link fence to get out of that place and run away. And how would it be able to do that? I mean, I'm pretty sure it just can't just hop a fence, right? So this story takes place in southeast Texas within 100 miles of Houston. I was in college but had moved back to my parents for a semester after some roommate drama. My parents live out in the country, miles outside of town, with some acreage. The land in the back consists of 4 zones. You have the backyard with the friendly St. Augustine. The back, which is a section of woods my parents cleared of underbrush and keep reasonably maintained, and the rear back is a clearing we used to do bonfires in and have parties and stuff in high school. And then there's woods for miles. After high school, my parents gave up on keeping back the brush and weeds from anything except their excellent backyard section. So, imagine a backyard fenced in by a wall of tall weeds and large trees that go back for miles, and then a field of giant weeds transitioning into solid, dense woods with oak, some pine, youpin, and briar. I also had this dog my parents let me keep outside. They had a big chain-link dog run she lived in, since my parents did not like dogs inside. This dog was not the type to stay in one spot anyway. She was aggressive to other dogs, always going after them, acting tough, and I sometimes worried she'd go out and kill the neighbor's chickens. She was about 60 pounds and not a jumpy or scared dog at all. Since I was in college, I had no curfew or anything and would always come home late at night or early in the morning after hanging out with friends or studying and whatnot. On this night, it was rather cold for Texas, being 50 degrees, and even though she had a house and a bed and straw out there, I felt bad for my dog, so I decided to bring her in to sleep in the garage. I should have been more careful because this happened quite a bit, but somehow this dog always got me. She would wait in the back until the gate was unlocked and I was in the run. Gate closed, unlocked, horseshoe latch, run around me, pop the gate latch with her nose and bolt off. So of course, she did this, and my dumbass was left standing in the run in the cold in the middle of the night. I was pissed because I knew I had to find her and bring her back. The moon was pretty bright and I had seen her fly into the weed wall and disappear, so I followed her without a light, calling her name. There were some little trails through the weeds and we tried to keep open access to the property, but these were less wide than a person could walk. The weeds were about a head taller than me, so it was dense. Anyway, I'd gone a ways in and had passed through the wooded section into the clearing. Probably 5 to 8 feet tall were these weeds that I was walking through. I got quiet, listening, trying to hear sounds of where she might be, and then I heard intermittent rustling throughout the woods, which are just simple tall dark outlines of trees at this point. Couldn't really see anything since the weed jungle. The rustling wasn't the sound I expected since she's usually crashing through the woods. I'm thinking, what the hell is she doing now? Honestly, I thought she was probably rolling around in some dead skunk, and I would have to bathe her. Figuring it was my wild-ass dog, I make my way over toward the noise, calling out her name again. As I got closer to the rustling, it was not the sound of an animal charging through the underbrush, but more like something intentionally shaking the trees. Like if you grab a tree branch and just shake it. All the connected trees and vines would shake. I was close enough now to make out individual branches silhouetted by the top of the tree line, and I could see whatever was causing the trees to shake up to the top. This was off, and decided that this was definitely not my dog prancing around. I shut up and froze. I hear in all these stories people talk about how they noticed when the woods go silent. Honestly, I can't even remember if this happened, but I heard 2 or 3 loud, deep huffs as I stood there. It sounded like a bull, but with a deeper fluttering. Not like the tonal sounds a cow makes, but the deep, heavy exhale when they're defensive. It seemed to come from around my head height. My mind took this and registered it as that this thing was a lot closer to me than the tree line. I also remember the distinct feeling that this noise was directed at me. I got this terrible feeling in my gut, like whole body fear and panic. Rational or not, I yelled my dog's name with all fear and urgency, you know when your voice gets higher and louder at the end, and turned and ran as fast as I could. Either my dog heard my tone and got scared, or she was afraid of whatever was going on in that tree line too, because I crashed through the weeds and she came up on my left from a creek and flew past me like a bullet. When I got to the open garage, she was trying to get in the back door to the house, jumping like a crazy animal. I closed the garage, put her in the kennel, and went to bed. I don't know what it was, and at the time I convinced myself it was one of those hogzillas you hear about on the news. I've been around plenty of cattle, and I've never heard one make that noise. Not saying it couldn't have been one, but something didn't feel right. This was 10 years ago now, but I know that I'm still going to think hard about it every time I go back to that property. I was 18 years old and in the Job Corps in Cedro-Woolley, Washington. It was late one night and all of us who had become friends were watching movies inside the day room. Me and a guy I became friends with decided to walk outside of the campus to this old mental hospital, I believe. It would help if you Googled it to find its name, but personally, I don't remember. I know it's either in Cedro-Woolley, Washington or outside Cedro-Woolley, Washington, sharing the same land as the Job Corps. So, anyway, we walked outside through this field, and we get to an area where we're standing facing the building on the side. So we're looking at it horizontally. You can tell that many of the windows are shattered, and the place looks old and messed up. Anyway, it looked like a light was in one of the rooms, and there was a crescent moon that night, kind of like a quarter moon up in the sky, so I turned to Jared and said, "Look, there's a light on." I was trying to scare him. I thought that the moon was reflecting off the back of the building or something and causing it to appear like there was a light on in that room. So he was getting freaked out, like, no way. How's there a light on? So then as we are talking, we look back and notice another light is on in the room right next to that one. So as we were talking, we were like gesturing with our bodies, so I assumed we had just moved a little bit. But it made the other room light up. So I started talking to him, and we started to walk back a little bit, and it seemed like my idea was right. Whenever we moved, that light turned off. The other room lit up. So this went on for a little bit when I pushed him back and forth slightly. And it looked like one room that was lit up with this light would go out. Then suddenly, it would look like the other room would light up. So we're standing there, talking. He's telling stories from what he's heard from other people around here about the asylum. Saying some electric chair was in there in the basement or something, and they used to do lobotomies and all kinds of crazy stuff. Said there's probably ghosts and all that. The whole time I was listening to this nonsense, thinking this was hilarious. So, we both looked back and both rooms were lit up with light, which surprised me because we didn't move at all. Then I looked at him and he looked at me, and we're like, weird. Both the rooms are lit up now. Then we look back in the chambers. They are black, pitch black, no light anywhere. I look back up and the moon is in the same spot and nothing had changed. So I don't understand how both of these rooms were just now all of a sudden lit up at the same time. And then right before our eyes, they both went dark. I don't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, but it looked like I could see a face in the window. Anyway, we went back the next day and looked around the windows to see if there were any lights in there or any signs of anybody that could have been living there or something. And it didn't appear anyone would be living there. The place was trashed, and we're way out in the mountains of Cedro-Woolley, a Job Corps. There's nothing around here. It was extraordinary, and we were at such a distance that if there was a person there, there's no way they could have been able to hear our conversation to try to play along. The way the room lit up, it just didn't seem like a flashlight or anything natural, and it definitely wasn't the moonlight. I live in the foothills of western North Carolina, near the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I used to live higher up in the mountains for a few years and hated it. So I wouldn't say I liked the woods with a burning passion, but yet I don't hate them, I guess. Recently I've moved back in with my folks in their cabin surrounded by the woods. The land my family owns stretches across 15 acres of woodland. Now, these are the woods I grew up in. Despite my typical aversion to nature, I feel safe in them. I climbed the trees, splashed in the creek, and played with stick swords when I was a kid. These woods are home to me, except for the area behind the backyard. Our cabin is on a steep hill that slopes down for about a half a mile. Eventually, it bottoms out on a creek down in the woods. The halfway point between the house and the stream is a little patch of woods, right behind the fenced-in area around the house. It's always in the shade, with no thick undergrowth, just trees, Carolina red clay, piles of leaves, the usual. but it feels bizarre down there in a way that I cannot explain. I feel very unwelcome, out behind the house for some reason, and I'm not the only one. My parents avoid it too. Even our pets, past and present, have always steered clear of it. So I will list some experiences that might get my point across better. The first experience was when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and one summer I thought I'd try camping in the backyard. So I set up my family's new tent and loaded it up with an air mattress and a pile of blankets, Copper, my beloved dear Stuffy, and some comic books. I wanted to be excited about it, but I felt uneasy even before the sun went down when my mom was helping me set up my little camping trip. The shady patch of woods around the backyard was just weird, but I was a kid, so I figured, F it, I'm 20 feet from the house, I'll be fine. I got set up for the night, stayed up reading comics, and felt like an outdoorsman, and it had barely gotten dark when I began hearing loud, rhythmic crunching in the woods. Behind the backyard, not too far from where I was, like something big was walking in circles around the undergrowth. We don't have bears in my neck of the wood. Besides, whatever it was walking on 2 legs. It never tried to approach the backyard, even as I sat there with Copper just listening to it. It just kept walking. I barely lasted an hour in that damn tent before running inside and getting into my bed. The second one is a little interesting. My mom's an avid gardener and decided she would put together 4 or 5 raised gardening beds in the backyard for herbs and veggies. This was when I was 11, so naturally I was roped into helping. We spent the first part of the day putting them together and getting them started. Then I noticed that we would get edgy and irritable back there. We're best friends and never fight, but we'd be snapping at each other constantly raising that damn garden. I also noticed that the backwoods behind our house were deathly quiet for the first time. Playing music or talking didn't make a difference. It was like that kind of silence that pressed in on you, and it's always just exactly the same back there. The beds thrived for a little while, but my mom always asked me to come with her when she tended to them. I thought it was silly at the time. She told me that she couldn't be down there by herself when I got older. She'd always wait until I was home from school before checking on them because she felt uneasy and unwelcome. Eventually, we would just abandon the project altogether. The raised beds are still down there, by the way, just rotting away in the undergrowth. Since middle school, I haven't checked on them, and I'm 23 now. This last experience I will share, in my opinion, is the creepiest. The time I asked my mom to cut my hair, we were poorer then, so Mom just gave me a nice, twice-monthly trim rather than go to a salon. It was late spring and warm, so she suggested that we cut it in the backyard for an easier cleanup. Was I maybe 13 or 14 at this point? I don't really remember correctly, so I'm just gonna go with either 13 or 14. So we ventured down. I brought a stool and diligently sat while she cut my hair. Side note, my mom has always cut my hair, so she is very good at it, and she doesn't make mistakes. This is important. As she worked and we talked, I noticed an old familiar feeling of unease. We were not welcome back there. The trees that stood still and shadowy despite the brilliant sunny day just sucked all of the energy away. I remember that it felt cold, very cold. My mom finished up my haircut and I shook off the extra debris to let her admire her handiwork. She stepped around in front of me, angled my head this way and that, and said it looked good. 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, I felt this squeeze of pressure on my lungs like I couldn't breathe. It was such a weird sensation that I froze. All of the uneasiness of the atmosphere pressed in on me all at once. Second, my mom got this odd, vacant look on her face. I remember her smile fading and her eyes going a little glassy like she was lost in thought. And then she reached out with the scissors, still making this blank expression, and snipped a deep cut into the skin right above my eye. I freaked out, screaming. I jumped off the stool and backed away. At the same time, she seemed to gather herself again, and she was almost in tears. She repeatedly apologized, not even bothering to take anything with us as we ran back to the house to treat the cut and stop the bleeding. I still have a little scar there, and she's never forgiven herself for it. There wasn't even any hair hanging over my eye either. I had a pixie cut at the time. So yeah, these are a few weird experiences that make me avoid the backyard now. I haven't even been down there in 7 or 8 years, but now that I'm living here again, I sometimes investigate the backyard and feel that weird shudder of apprehension. What's the deal? Why don't we feel welcome in the 50 square foot patch of land we own? Why is it so dark and quiet in this one spot? I have no idea, but my parents and I work around it and pretend that it's not there. I lived in Utah for a year now, and I've got to say it's the most beautiful state, in my opinion. Mountain ranges, valleys, and ski resorts galore, but there is a dangerous side of the wilderness here too, especially in the mountains. I've lived in multiple places in this state, such as Heber, Midway, Provo, St. George, etc. A little bit about me is that I'm an avid angler, and this story takes place in southern Utah. It was the weekend, and my dad often went fishing after a long week's work. We had decided to go to Quail Lake State Park for our weekend trip. A fantastic view of mountains, clear water, and big fish is all we needed. We had gotten there at about 3 to 4 in the afternoon and tossed our lines out. After some time, I thought it was a good idea to find a new spot to be by myself, so I trailed across this creek that followed into the river and then to the lake, traversing over hills, banks, and rocks to see where I'd think I'd have the best luck, and I stumbled upon a little peak out in the water and started setting up my rods. It was 7 o'clock and the sun was setting when I started getting a weird feeling that I shouldn't be there, but I stayed anyway. Nature around me soon started getting quiet and the occasional car passing across the lake, but I had blown it off thinking I came here to fish and relax, trying not to stress myself out. My dad texted me saying it was time to go. I checked my phone for the time and 2 hours had already passed. The sun was past to set and no moonlight. So I started packing and went on my way hiking back over the hills and banks. On the trail to that spot, a lengthy rock bank with tall trees in the water caved into each other like a swamp that I crossed to get there. On the way back to the car, I had come to realize that that part of the trail had a massive splash, like someone had jumped in front of me in those trees, like full force. I could see the ripples come to shore, and there was no way anything smaller than 130 pounds made that disturbance in the water. It creeped me out, but I blew it off as a branch falling or something like that, as there were a lot of waterlogged trees that had been rotted. So I kept trucking along. Not even 5 seconds later, there were more sounds of something trudging through the water, and it sounded like it kept getting closer. The moment that happened, I snapped my head around with my flashlight and the noises instantly stopped. I then remembered my knife that I had on me and pulled it out, yelling at whoever or whatever was making that noise to not come near me. I sat for days, scanning the trees, waiting for whatever it was to charge me, but nothing happened. I kept walking back past that rock bank, and almost as soon as I got off that bank, the splashes came back, but way closer than before. I started running, and whatever was following me stayed on my tail, but every time I looked back, there was nothing but waves from it. I had then crossed the creek like I had done before, coming to the hill straight up to where my dad had parked a million times. I stopped and turned around to get a good look at whatever this thing was finally, and there was no more splashing, no more ripples, and I saw nothing. But what has me questioning my sanity is that I could only hear water falling off the body of whatever was following me. I was scanning the rest of the trees and the bank and never saw a thing. I quickly turned around, ran up to the hill, got into the car, and told my dad to drive. I told him what happened, and to no surprise, he didn't believe me at first until I told him the whole story and how serious my demeanor was. I still occasionally go out to Quail Lake, and I still haven't seen anything close to that experience. It's not only a story, but one of these things that sticks out to me the most. It still leaves me wondering who or what was with me that night. Hi Swamp Dweller, I've been listening to your stories for a couple of years now, and I'm envious of the experience others have had on this channel. So to give you some background, I'm from South Africa. I'm a 26-year-old female, and the people here aren't as rich as many other cultures worldwide. However, We believe in several cryptids and other folklore you may find interesting. Without further ado, here is my story. My dad and I occasionally hike the local mountain range. We usually head out at dawn to avoid the hot African sun. My dad called and said he wanted to do a night trail this time. He is an ex-cop, so nothing freaks him out. I agreed and decided to leave my phone in the car as we pulled up to the nature reserve's parking lot. Dust clouded the air, which is expected this time of year. I wish I had taken my phone with me. God, I was so stupid. We hiked for about 4 miles up a steep slope and over a cliff. I was exhausted, but my dad looked like he was barely breaking a sweat. Suddenly, we hear someone cry out for help. My dad, being the hero, started to respond to the voice and told him where we were. Mind you, it's past sunset, light is limited, and we only have 2 flashlights to guide us. In a childlike voice, the voice kept repeating the exact words, "Help me, I'm hurt," and "Help me, I need help." I grabbed my dad's arm and froze. I knew something was not right. I yelled back, "What is your name?" And the childlike voice replied, "Help me, I'm hurt," in the same tone. I whispered to my dad, "We need to leave, now." He protested and wanted to help, but I knew this was no child. We hauled back to the safety of the cliffs, and with our flashlights bouncing as we sprinted down the slippery slopes. We both fell a few times, and I swear I saw something following us. In the bushes, it wasn't even too far away. It looked like an animal, crouching and waiting for me to turn my back. My dad and I reached the car in daylight. We never stopped running. We collapsed next to the car's trunk, and my dad swore like a sailor. We never really spoke about our experience after it happened. We just warned people not to go hiking in the cliffs and mountains after dark. I'm a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. Around 6 months ago, this incident took place on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, about an hour's drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this a long time and I know enough what happens when you post things on the internet. Whether it's a golf course, abandoned mine, ghost, or whatever it may be, people usually come flocking with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, this trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon, a simple in-and-out overnight trip. I planned to go with my friend, but the last-minute cancellation on his part left me on my own. So, with a packed bag and a car ready to go, I decided to go independently. I was not leaving the house on time and having trouble navigating through forest roads. I didn't arrive at the trailhead until around 5:45. For those of you who don't backpack, this is a huge no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast, so I figured I would move quick. I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot to stop. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Walking in the dark by itself can be scary, especially for where I was being on my own. Eventually, it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and set up a camp for the night. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot. But there were some burnt pieces of wood in the remains of a fire circle, hence it looked like people had been there before, but not very recently. My priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area and was able to find some dry wood, and I got the fire going. I got my tarp out, set it up, and cracked open a can of chili mac I had brought with me. I was looking forward to eating, as I was very tired. I felt good, my camp was set up, and my food was on the fire. The uneasiness that I had from the hike had almost gone away completely, and concern from the walk-in had virtually gone away. But it was still there, a side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened, I must explain how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you are in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it and everything on the edge of that circle. And past it, you're pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating dinner when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at the tiny rock in shock as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light on and towards the area where I'd seen the rock come from, and due to the density of pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for whoever had thrown that rock, not daring to stray too far away from the fire that in hindsight offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I convinced myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night not expecting the pure terror that would unfold. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, barely inaudible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I heard the rustling of leaves, harder to hear as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab the handheld flashlight that I had next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got as I realized that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag, ducked out of my tarp, and looked around. I could see the light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight lying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I have almost crapped my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me past the tree line in the woods. I hurriedly slipped on my boots, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed out my options, staying here and waiting out the night or attempting the 3-mile hike back to my car, in the dark. I figured that whoever or whatever was out here with me was going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light, so I decided to stay in the camp and wait it out. Eventually it came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could listen to it. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would wander too far away and I would lose the sound of its steps, but then an hour later, maybe 2, it would return still faint as ever. This went on for 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer until they were easily 7 feet away from me. The fire had been tiny as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped and everything went silent. I sat there for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand, praying for 2 hours, taking the knife into my other hand and praying that I would hear nothing else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light to see that I was alone at my campsite. I packed my things up and speed walked the hell out of there. I did a record 3-mile hike. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in and drove, and didn't stop until I was at least 20 miles away. I had stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, mostly just to see and talk to another human being. As I exited the store, I read what was written in the dust on the back of my window. It said, "Sleep well." Many things have happened to me on my various adventures, especially through Arizona, but this was the most mysterious and scariest day by far, so I thought I'd share it. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay far away from there. Hello, Swamp Dweller. My name is Daniel. I've been deciding whether or not I should share my story with you or not, but I think it's time to do it. I believe I encountered multiple skinwalkers. One day, about 2 months ago, my friends and I were talking about cryptids and trying to hunt one down to get it on camera. So one of my friend's brothers, who I will call Chris, decided to plan a trip into the woods. So I told him we could go hunting for whatever was there. We would have to go in the dark, with only flashlights and a GoPro. It would probably be our best bet. So fast forward 2 days. I get to his house and we smoke a little Mary J before heading out into the journey. So we get to the field right down the road, and it just so happens to be where I feel very creeped out, when I'm alone at night riding home on my bike. So we get out there with flashlights and get to the middle of the field by the wood line. I told him that if we are going to get anything on camera, the best bet would be to go into the woods. So we walk further down and go into the brush of thorns and trees. We pick a spot to sit and wait for something to happen. After about 10 minutes passed, we started hearing a noise that sounded like a deer running by the tree line. Then, 2 more minutes go by, and we hear what sounded like a very big bird flapping its wings above the trees. "What the hell was that?" I asked Chris. But before he could even say anything, it sounded like a crowd of 20 deer running by the tree line. So Chris looked back at me, and I said, "Screw that, bro, we gotta get out of here." So we get up after the noises stopped and walked a couple of feet, but my heart dropped because I heard what sounded like a giant tree breaking not even 15 feet from where we stood. So I said we have to go now, and darted through the brush and out of the woods through the field. And this is when I would have my first glimpse at what looked like 4 glowing orange eyes in the trees. And so at that point we started walking, trying to calm down because my friend told me that we should act like we didn't see anything. But then I got the bright idea to look back from where we came. I saw what I can only describe as an old lady in a white dress standing in the spot where we saw those eyes in the deer before. I told Chris, I said, "Hey man, do you see that?" And to my surprise he said yes, and then he just said to keep walking. So I looked back again, and this time, whatever this thing was, it was running full speed at us now. So then we ran like hell to the house, shut the door, and hoped that this thing wouldn't come inside. We locked every door, every window, and made sure nothing was able to see inside. We didn't come out for the rest of the night. We tried to avoid going in the woods at night ever again after this as well. I'm not entirely sure how to really describe this experience other than that it was absolutely terrifying. I just hope that I was able to do it justice in this retelling. I like to look for new, out-of-the-way fishing holes. If I'm on a trip and have gear, I'll pull up a map, look at different connecting waterways, and try to find back roads that may lead to spots that few people know about. On one trip about 10 years ago, I'm in western Pennsylvania, and I'm looking for a road to connect me to this small, out-of-the-way stream I found on the map. I'm in the country, and it's not too lonely. But the houses are getting farther and farther apart, and the woods are becoming more and more prominent. I surmise that I am close to where this stream is supposed to be, so I turn down a dirt road that leads down toward a tree line in the direction I believe the stream to be. The route starts in okay shape, but as soon as I pass into the tree line, things begin to get weird. It's only mid-afternoon, but the canopy of trees is so thick that it suddenly feels like it's dusk outside. Then, the road very quickly deteriorates, starts to close in, and then starts to vanish altogether. There are banks on either side of me, so I figure I'm on some old logging road that rarely, if ever, gets vehicles on it anymore. The quote-unquote road is getting worse and worse as I go on. Large rocks start appearing at random spots in the road, first sporadically, and then more frequently. It's very unnatural looking. It's like they were placed on purpose. My car is 4-wheel drive, and I'm getting a little worried because the rocks are getting more prominent, and combining this with how tight the road is, and driving around them becoming sketchy, I'm driving very slowly. Not to pop a tire or to make a wrong move and get stuck on the bank or something. The road suddenly takes a very sharp left-hand and downward turn. I creep along with this turn, but stop as I see the road continuing with this weird downward trajectory. At this moment, my gut starts telling me to turn around, but at this point, I realize I can't. The road is not wide enough to do a 3-point turn. I could change it, but I didn't want to get my front end caught on something pushing over the bank or my back end going off the back either. I say, keep pushing forward, and you are bound to get just enough room to turn around shortly. As I drive this weird downward road with sharp curves and oddly placed rocks, I start to see items off to the side of the road. At first it was just garbage, bottles, boxes, wrappers, etc. Devastating enough to see in the woods. Then I start seeing toys. Kids' toys. Lots of them, like an uncomfortable amount. Then I start seeing clothing. Some of them look old and weathered, like they've been there for years, and some look new. The number of clothing I would see increased as I continued on. Then I start seeing mattresses. Not one random bed, but lots of mattresses. All over the place. There are dirty, dark stains on them. My gut is now screaming at me to get out, but I still don't have the room to turn around. While sitting there and trying to figure out my next move, I get that distinct feeling like I'm being watched. The moment that feeling hits me, I audibly yell at myself, "Nope," and I slam the car in reverse and drive in reverse, dodging all the random rocks and back up out of the sharp turns until the path levels out again. I go full F this mode and risk making a 3-point turn. My back end goes slightly off the bank and I slam back into the drive and pound the gas to throw myself back onto the road and out of whatever dark woods BS I had discovered. I have no clue what happened that day. Best case scenario, it was probably some deep woods meth den. I know that no matter what I'm doing, the moment my gut starts telling me to get out, I absolutely get out. Let me start by saying that this is a true story that happened to me when I was 13 years old, and I am 27 now. Whether you believe it or not is up to you. My dad used to be part of a small hunting club in Alabama, just a handful of guys he grew up with. Once a year we would drive to a small town of Elba to camp for a few days and go hunting. The club owned a few different areas of land around the city, and club members could go tracking there. One of these pieces of land was nicknamed the cemetery because it had an old cemetery on it. There was nothing really creepy about the cemetery. It was just old. It was in the woods and the graves were of an enslaver and his slaves. Now, in this area of land nicknamed the cemetery, there are 5 or 6 green fields, a cleared out piece with no trees, grass, and a buck hut to hunt in. A buck hut is a treehouse you sit in and wait for deer to walk out onto a green field. This evening, we were going to hunt on Greenfield 1. The plot is directly behind the old cemetery. The evening started normal enough, and my dad parked the truck and we walked down the trail to the buck hut. We climbed up and started to wait and watch the woods. A bit of time passed, and my dad told me that he would go for a short walk to see if maybe there's any deer on the trail. Keep in mind I'm about 13 years old. This isn't too much of a big deal, I've hunted by myself before, and at this point I'm not afraid of being alone in the woods. Besides, it was still light out, so I could see everything rather well. So I said okay and he climbed down. It was just me, my .32 caliber Marlin rifle, the grass field in front of me, and the dense woods around me. This is where things start to get strange. I sat there for a while, for what felt like an eternity. And it was now almost twilight. My concern for my dad was growing because he was still not back. I was worried that something might have happened to him or he got lost. However, he is an experienced hunter, an expert if you will. If he were lost, he would yell or fire off a shot, but the woods had been dead silent the entire time. I figured he found a good spot that he wanted to hunt in the twilight or dusk hour of the day because that's prime time for hunting. So I focused on the grass field in front of me, just watching, listening, and waiting for a deer to walk out of the field as the light of the day began to fade. Just then, across the field I saw and heard some brush moving and breaking. The thought did cross my mind that it could be my dad, and I highly doubted it though. There was no way it could be him. This thing sounded incredibly heavy, and that would be incredibly dangerous and stupid. I raised my rifle and pulled back the hammer. I aimed it at the moving brush, and patiently waited for what I hoped was a deer to walk out. Then a girl floated out of the woods onto the grassy field. She was transparent white with a long flowing dress and long white hair. She sailed from one side of the field to the other and disappeared back into the woods. I watched her for a solid minute or two. I could not believe my eyes and I was petrified. Now, I wanted my dad back instantly. A short time had gone by and it was now pitch black out here and I was still all alone. My concern for my dad turned into a panic, but I was too afraid to yell or look for him in the pitch black woods where I had just seen a ghost. I sat there for hours, terrified all alone in the darkness. Thankfully, he finally returned. He acted as if he hadn't been gone for long at all. I asked him where the heck he went, and he said that he just went for a short walk up the trail, turned around, and came back. The timeline made no sense because he was gone for easily 2 hours. It was unlike him to leave me alone for that long. He was adamant that he was only gone for 15 to 30 minutes. We walked down the trail back to his truck and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The whole experience still confuses me to this day. Was the ghost I saw an old slave or enslaver buried in the woods behind me? Or something else entirely? Did my dad go through some sort of time warp? Maybe time sped up for him or slowed down for me. I don't know. I never went hunting there again, and I don't plan on returning to those woods at all. So my story starts when I was 15 years old in 2012. This happened with me and 3 of my very best friends, who I shall call Luke, who was 17, Lewis, who was 16, and Gary, who was also 15. We decided to go camping, and since our dads all worked in the military, we had access to some woods that weren't very far from our homes, maybe only 3 miles at most. Of course, we weren't trained on anything, but since I had spent some time in the middle of the Amazon forest, I was confident that I would be able to handle a night out here in the Brazilian woods. Since it was July, which is winter here in Brazil, it was cold, like 5 degrees Celsius, and things were going pretty much as you would expect from a camp in the woods. We were pretty much sat there and chatting until about 1 a.m. Then we decided to take shift in duos to watch out for tents for any animals or anything nearby. We were afraid of jaguars, but probably the most that could get near us would be some common capybaras in the region. At around 4 a.m., Gary, my duo, was outside the tent calling for me to stay up with him. But as it was so cold, I wanted to stay inside, saying that no animal would go near us with the noise we were making. After about 5 minutes of the back and forth between us, we could no longer hear any forest noises, like crickets, owls, and twigs breaking from animals passing by. A feeling of uneasiness started to grow between us. Now, I know this whole thing of no forest noise and yada 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 sounds a little cliche, but I swear this is real. When something weird is about to happen, it commonly falls silent in the woods. I can't explain it. With this feeling, we stopped arguing and started to pay attention to what was happening around us. We did not want to wake Luke and Lewis because we thought we were being silly at first and nothing would happen. But then, we hear a scream from the middle of the woods. It sounded like a woman screaming, but at the same time it didn't. The cry sounded human, but something was definitely off. It had some animalistic tone behind it. It's hard to explain. I searched all over the internet and couldn't find a creature that even remotely sounded like it, as I firmly believed it was not a human screaming. Besides, what would a woman be doing in the middle of the woods, possibly alone at night? With the sound, Luke and Lewis woke up, a little disoriented, while Gary and I jumped out of the tent and grabbed some sticks. That was the only thing we could find that could serve as a weapon at the time. We did not sleep for the rest of that night, as we not so patiently waited for the morning to come so we could pack up and get the heck out of there. Only about 5 minutes after this event, the forest resumed its regular noises, and we all calmed down a bit. When the sun rose, we packed our things as fast as we could and got out of there. When we were outside of the forest, we told the military that was guarding the woods what we heard, but I'm sure they believed it was some random teenagers messing with us. I'm still friends with those guys that camped with me, and as I said, every time I see them, I ask them if they remember the fact, and they all say they remember it. And I still can't imagine what was screaming that night. I still really believe we were in danger. In August of 2019, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles around the United States. I most often preferred to wild camp, so rather than staying in proper campgrounds, I would find a place to disappear into the woods for the night. Sometime in late December, I was wild camping somewhere in rural Montana. I was quite a way into the woods, far from the nearest town. I went off into the woods and set up camp. After using the last few minutes of sunlight to eat dinner, brush my teeth, and write in my journal, I laid down to get some rest. Over the past month or so of sleeping in the woods, I had grown very accustomed to the nighttime sounds of the forest. The chirping of crickets, the croaking of toads can be very loud. There was always at least a slight breeze rustling through the trees. It was always a highlight of my night, though not exceptionally uncommon, to hear the distant yips and howls of coyotes, and one night I was very excited to hear 2 owls, one on either side of my tent, hooting back and forth. So that one night in Montana, it was alarming to be surrounded by a completely silent forest, with no noise coming from it at all. There was not a single sound to be heard. Even the air was dead still, with no breeze to rustle the dry leaves of autumn still clinging to the trees. It was honestly terrifying. On that night, there would occasionally be the snapping of a twig or some other such sound that would usually be lost in the other commotion. But that night, there was no background noise to mask the few sounds that popped up, so all of those little twig snapping type sounds seemed 100 times louder. On that trip, I slept in boisterous places. Like the night I pitched my tent right next to some train tracks that ended up being much more active than I thought. I shared a hostel room with a guy who snored and a bunkmate who talked in his sleep on the same night. But that night of absolute silence in the woods of Montana was the worst night of that trip that I spent 180 days on. It was the loudest silence I have ever heard, which terrified me. There was always a distinct feeling of being watched that entire night. Every time I closed my eyes, I just felt like I was going to be rushed by something. I can't tell you exactly what caused that feeling that night. Maybe there was a predator around. Maybe there was something more nefarious. But all I can say is be careful in the woods, because there's stuff that might just be out of the possibility of our understanding, lurking just behind the next tree. I do wildlife photography, so I go hiking every Sunday, and have been for about a year now. With the frequency I go hiking, it might be surprising that I've only had 2 experiences that freaked me out. Or maybe not. I'm not really sure what to make of them. Both of my experiences take place in the western part of Wisconsin. My first experience was at a semi-defunct state campground in the middle of the summer. I say semi-defunct because there was a somewhat newer gravel parking lot by the gravel road, and a gated off road that apparently led deeper into the woods that went to some sort of RV or campsite. It's about a mile from the gravel parking lot to the paved lot, and this walk goes fine. The road continues past the paved lot for about a mile, then splits into almost non-existent trails. After I got past the paved lot, things started to get truly strange. I began to get a feeling that was hard to describe. It just felt wrong. With every step I took, I thought that I really shouldn't be here. You really shouldn't take another step. You should turn around. This feeling kept growing and growing in intensity until I got to the end of the road, and I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and went back because I felt this strong intensity, this feeling that if I went on the trail, something terrible would happen. The walk back to the gravel lot was fine, and by the time I got to it, the feeling was gone entirely, and I looked for agates on the gravel road. I will say I think the second one was probably just a deer, but I'll let you decide. This hike was in the early fall. I went off trail down a gully and followed a small creek. It was a good hike until I rounded a bend and saw a cave. My initial thought was to go check it out, but the nagging feeling was like, no, there is something bad in there. I was admittedly thinking more along the lines of a homeless person. As soon as I turned away, I had that same feeling of being watched that many people describe in these stories, and I just had to get out of there. So I backtracked my steps about 2 miles into the hike when the feeling suddenly got much more intense. My eyes were darting all over the place. I was almost walking sideways on the trail. Then suddenly there was a massive crash behind me to my right. I didn't see anything before or after the collision, but as I started running in fear, I tripped, looked up behind me, and saw what I could only describe as the silhouette of a deer. But what makes this more intense and terrifying is that this silhouette was standing on 2 legs. I don't even know how to explain it. This feeling intensified until I got to my car, though. The feeling of being watched, the feeling of being followed, the feeling of absolute danger. It got better as I collected myself in the car and drove away. I don't know how to explain these events. It could simply be an overactive fight or flight response, but they stick out so much from all the other experiences that I've had that I just wanted to share them with the show. Thanks for listening to these allegedly true and downright creepy deep woods and outdoors horror stories. As always, if you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this episode gets, the more the algorithm pushes it, and that helps the swamp grow. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss new uploads, as I upload them nearly every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, please be sure to give this a 5-star rating, as it helps me out a ton. If you'd like to support the swamp outside of all that, maybe check us out on Twitch. I stream multiple times a week. We play horror games and do other stuff of the like. You can find a link in the description. Be sure to join me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode.